Hello, and welcome to the first day in this year's virtual onboard conference on nonprofit board service, hosted by the Rustandy Center for Social Sector Innovation. I'm Carolyn Grossman, Executive Director of the Rustandy Center and Adjunct Assistant Professor of Strategy here at the University of Chicago Booth School of Business. Now it's in its 8th year, which makes me pinch myself because I haven't missed one yet. The Onboard Conference is built on the belief that nonprofits and their boards of directors have the potential to drive social and environmental change. Today's event is bringing together university alumni, nonprofit leaders, current students, people around the city of Chicago, the country, and the world interested in making an impact on the issues that they care about. As Chicago Booth's social impact hub, the Rustandy Center also believes that serving on a board is a meaningful way to give back. That's why a tenet of Onboard remains helping to connect would-be board members with nonprofits. And as with all of our work, Onboard elevates insights from research and from practice, encourages innovation and using business fundamentals to tackle pressing challenges, and aims to develop the people and practices with the potential to truly change the world. But because this has not been a typical year, this will not be our typical Onboard. This year forced many nonprofits to change their approaches, whether by rethinking service models, scaling existing efforts in either direction, growth or scaling back, or revisiting missions. As we designed Onboard 2021, we wanted to respond to these challenges by offering sessions that provided insights on topics like learning to lead through the lens of inclusion, understanding which fundraising strategies are unique to COVID-19 and the climate in which we're living, and which ones will persist well into the future. Nonprofits have thought about how to leverage board members to manage multi-layered crises when they arise, and so much more. Before we jump into today's event, I'd like to extend special thanks to our platinum sponsor, William Blair, for helping to bring this year's conference to life. William Blair is such a strong partner of the Rustandy Center, supporting the Onboard Conference, our impact investing programs, and community-based initiatives. Through this support, William Blair demonstrates a deep commitment to developing the people and practices necessary to strengthen the social sector and our communities. Truly, thank you. So today, we'll lay the groundwork for the topics that we'll explore throughout Onboard. We'll kick things off with our keynote, featuring an impressive panel of social impact leaders, sharing insights on the challenges nonprofits have faced this past year and how they plan to apply learnings to their future work. We'll then transition into our breakout sessions. I hope to see many of you there. I will be in at least one of them. So if you registered for the Finding Your Right Fit Board workshop, you'll kickstart your nonprofit board search. If you registered for a networking session, you'll have the opportunity to connect in small groups. And if you didn't register for either, you can still do so by navigating to the All Sessions page on the CVent Attendee Hub and selecting Add Session. And if you have questions, you can message any of the organizers. So with that, let's dive into today's keynote. This discussion will provide a helpful framing for the sessions to come by exploring the donor response to the pandemic and this year's racial reckoning, how nonprofits and their supporters can adapt, the role that boards can play in helping nonprofits push forward anti-racist missions, and really how the nonprofit sector is transforming as a result of this year's events. After our panelists discuss a series of questions, we'll leave some time to take questions from all of you. So please feel free to submit a question anytime using the Q&A feature on the right side of your browser, and we'll try to get to as many questions as time allows. I'm going to just quickly introduce our speakers, but I encourage you to check out their full profiles on the speakers page of the CVent Attendee Hub. So our moderator is a dear friend of mine, Julie Stasch, currently the Philanthropy Executive in Residence at the Rustandy Center for Social Sector Innovation and the immediate past president of the John D. and Catherine K. MacArthur Foundation. Julia is also chair of the board of the MacArthur affiliate Lever for Change, and is just an incredible partner to the Rustandy Center, to the city of Chicago, to any organization she touches, as she really helps advance all of our work towards even more good. So thank you, Julie, for joining us and moderating this session. We're also joined by Gloria Castillo, currently the director of We Rise Together, and also the previous past president of and CEO of Chicago United. Bradford Smith is the president of Candid and also serves on the boards of the Tinker Foundation and the International Center for Transitional Justice. And Kevin Washington, the president and CEO of the YMCA of the USA, the 14th person to lead the organization and the first African-American to lead the Y in the US, and is also on the boards of Springfield College, the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation, and the Chicagoland Chamber of Commerce. I'm truly honored to be introducing this panel, this keynote, this conference. Thank you to my team who has put together this just wonderful set of events. And with that, I will turn it over to Julia Stasch.
Well, thank you, Caroline. Thank you so much. It's an honor for the four of us to kick off the conference this year. And I'm excited to join Brad and Kevin and Gloria in conversation. So let's just, as Caroline said, let's dive right in. So the fact is, and I'm sure that each and every one of you listening in today knows this, that nonprofit board members and their leaders face an enormous challenge that requires many things, but 5 things come to mind for me. First and foremost, a demand for really critical self-reflection, a demand for agility, a demand for openness to new ways and new alliances, a willingness to experiment and reimagine. And then for me, one of the most important things is an exquisite, absolutely exquisite understanding of the changing environment, how and where resources come from, how the lives and livelihoods of customers, clients, constituents have been altered, sometimes even disordered and dislocated, and what this moment in American history is demanding with respect to race. Carolyn described the 3 themes that animate this conversation. The first is how donors are responding to the pandemic and the demand for a racial reckoning. So let's start with you, Brad. Overall, why don't you tell us a little bit about what the donor response to the COVID-19 pandemic and to the demand for attention to racial disparities. Tell us about the donor response to these seminal events in our history.
Okay, well, thanks, Julia. Just real quickly, Candid, for those of you who don't recognize the name immediately, we're not that dental supply company that you sometimes see with Candid. We're actually an 80-year-old startup that was created through the merger of what was the Foundation Center and what was GuideStar into essentially information service for the social sector. We track information about nonprofits, about foundation giving, and we follow the money and the flows of money throughout the sector, who's giving it, who's getting it, and to what issues and what populations it's going. We've been, since the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, we've been tracking in real time as much information as we could about donor response. In the case of COVID, to date, beginning February of last year, we've been able to track nearly $23 billion of grants and pledges that have been made around the world. What's really fascinating about this is when we first started tracking this, there was very little activity in the United States. It was all China. It was Chinese corporations and Chinese foundations providing COVID relief resources in China. Then the world map moved to Italy and Spain and parts of Europe as the COVID pandemic hit Europe. Then it came to the US. Now the US giving is eclipsed the giving in all other countries. So $23 billion in grants and pledges that we've tracked so far. After George Floyd was murdered in Minneapolis, immediately within weeks, actually within a week, corporations and celebrities were very quick to step up and make pledges. It seemed the minimum amount of a pledge was about $100 million on up. Then we began to see foundations come in, and we have tracked since George Floyd's murder $16.2 billion in racial equity pledges and grants. Now, what's really interesting about that is since, we tracked 12.6 billion. Since 2011, the total we've been able to track is 16.2 billion. So 12.6 of that 16.2 has come since George Floyd was murdered. So there's a tremendous influx of resources into the field. And maybe as we get into the discussion, there's a lot of hope with that, but there's also some patterns that we're seeing in terms of where the money's going and who's benefiting that look more like old philanthropy than a revolutionary new approach to addressing inequality in our society.
Well, thank you for kicking that off. I think we'll want to dig in a little bit more into exactly where the money is going and whether or not it actually signals a real inflection point in American history. But Gloria, We Rise Together, and the rest of that title is For an Equitable and Just Recovery. That is an initiative that's a forward-looking initiative that's born out of the Chicago Community Trust COVID-19 response fund. But what were some of the lessons from the pooling and distribution of resources of the response fund that are fueling the recovery effort?
Well, Julia, first let me say it's wonderful to be with you, and I'm so thrilled to have an opportunity to talk to people who are interested in board service. The Rapid Response Fund taught us a great deal. First of all, in just 6 months, over 6,000 generous donors raised more than $35 million, and 100% of those dollars went back into the community in this response effort. And that was for emergency services and basic needs. What we learned in this process was that, and you spoke to this, is that leaders must be agile, and they were very agile in this effort. And we brought together the Chicago Community Trust and United Way of Metropolitan Chicago. Those two CEOs, Helene Gale and Sean Garrett, were able to work collaboratively. And what's critical about this is we understand that the board must have confidence in their leaders in order to be agile. So it's really an important part of collaboration is that you have a strong relationship between the leaders of an organization and the board. We also learned that we can collaborate across organizations because we had professionals from many foundations working side by side to leverage their knowledge and their systems in order to make the grants that really moved $35 million out in a matter of weeks. We also found that those hyper-local organizations who received the dollars, it was important that they were proximate to those who were most in need. And it was because we were able to work collaboratively as a foundation community with a deep knowledge of those nonprofit organizations and the communities they served that we were able to be effective in this kind of emergency and very, very critical response time. And then finally, the fact that the philanthropic community has become very agile in utilizing data was also a very important factor in this particular moment, because we needed to understand where the impact of COVID-19 was having its kind of worst effects. So we knew that the Black and Latinx communities in Chicago had higher infection rates, higher morbidity rates. They were more economically fragile. They had higher rates of business closure, and they were struggling to get the kind of federal support that they needed. So they needed help with that infrastructure. So there was a good deal to be learned, but that really showed us how important it was to have agile leadership and a cohesive community in order to respond in a moment of crisis.
So Brad, Gloria is talking about this in the local concentrated geography of Greater Chicagoland. From your vantage point, your national vantage point, tell us about some other funder experimentations. What are some of the things that funders did that were revealed that they could work in different ways to support nonprofits? tell us about some of those experiments and whether or not you think some of them are here to stay.
Yeah, no, for sure. And, our organization, we track foundation and nonprofit activity across the entire United States and around the world. So we look at the whole sector. And there are lots of interesting examples we're seeing. One of the big trends we're seeing is last year, especially, a lot of foundation funders got in touch with the organizations they were supporting and said, the grant that we have with you, has restrictions. Can we ease those restrictions or totally eliminate those restrictions and turn this into general operating support? Because the demand and the need was so great for nonprofits that foundations were very quick to realize that, they didn't need more conditionality on the grant. They didn't need more restrictions. They didn't need a bureaucratic process that could get them funds in 6 to 10 months. What they needed was the freedom to be able to use the resources that they'd already received to maximum benefit. So that's one of the things we're seeing. The other is just a renewed interest in foundations in making general operating support grants. General operating support is not the majority of grant support made by foundations. Most grant report is restricted for certain outcomes. There's a mismatch between the demand for general operating support and the supply of general operating support. And we're beginning to see an uptick in general operating support. And then I think the other thing we're seeing is just sort of new forms of philanthropy that have arisen. Gloria talked about this kind of very closely coordinated, collaborative effort working at speed and under pressure. That's something new. The foundations aren't really known for speed. So when foundations are able to do something like that, it's really worth noting. And then we see things like Mackenzie Scott, who didn't create a foundation. Basically, she hired a bunch of consultants. She did a lot of quiet work behind the scenes to examine which organizations were delivering the most vital services in a crisis, and then came public with a blog piece saying that I'm giving away $5 billion to the following organizations. And most all of that funding, as far as we know, was for institutional support and general operating support. So this idea somehow that to meet with current needs as well as long-term social and environmental challenges, you need viable organizations. And viable organizations need flexible support. I really hope that's a trend that's here to stay.
And maybe flexible institutional support reflects a higher degree of trust in the relationship between a grantor and a grantee. But Gloria, you talked about organizations actually being really challenged by the economic consequences of the pandemic. But let's turn to Kevin for a second. Many YMCAs were actually forced to suspend traditional operations or close facilities. But as I understand it, they pivoted quickly to continue serving their communities. What did that look like in different places across the country?
Well, thank you for having me. Just so you know, 97% of our facilities, and so to give you some concept of what that means for many folks, we're in 10,000 communities. We have 2,700 facilities across the country. And that's not only local facilities, but 97% of them were closed or temporary closed. 75% of staff were furloughed or laid off. And just to give you an example, our collective revenue losses across the network. So for 2019, we did 8.4 billion across the network. For that time, the losses exceeded over $3 billion for the YMCA. So it was devastating for us. And despite that, we turned to really become what I would say is a vital community asset and really highlighted some of the things that Brad has talked about. We had childcare for our healthcare workers and emergency responders. We had over 1,300 sites set up across the country to deal with those issues. Food distribution became a significant issue because with schools being closed and opportunities for kids to get access to food, YMCAs supported that network with over 1,100 sites. We did hundreds of thousands of wellness checks for senior citizens across the country, blood drives, and even sheltering the homeless in some of our places. In Chicago, in Los Angeles, we worked with the city government to house some of the homeless folks to ensure that they were not exposed to some of the issues of COVID. You know, I've worked for the organization for 43 years. I know I look young, don't worry about it. I have never been prouder of the work that was going on. You know, it was really a vital community asset going to work, partnering with hospitals, the American Red Cross, food banks, and as a highly collaborative organization, we know that our ability to collaborate really reinforces the opportunity to provide access in those areas that we talked about, food, children, and things of that nature. And the final thing, Brad, you really talked about it. Several of our donors that we were close to relieved the restrictions so that we can use those resources in an unrestricted way to support much of the work that we talked about. That was a key to helping us get through some of the times that we're currently in. It was, we pivoted and had to, and never.
But I think what both of you are talking about is a degree of agility, both on the part of donors and on the part of nonprofits that the times really required. And so that is a characteristic, I'm hopeful, is something that boards really try to engender going forward on both parts. But Kevin, one follow-up for you. The nonprofit sector worked closely together to advocate for support from the federal government. How did that collaboration come about and what did it achieve?
Well, we were fortunate to be able to collaborate collectively. And I will tell you, I had a phone call with Neil Denton, who's my senior officer in Washington, D.C. And it was clear to me, while Philanthropy has done a great job, I knew, and all of us knew, that it wouldn't be enough to close the gap that nonprofit organizations were going to face during this period. And the only entity that could do that was the federal government. So collectively, very rarely do nonprofits work as collaborative as we had under these circumstances, but they did. And it really formed what I would call a trade group. Some of what the airlines was doing and the restaurants and others were doing, nonprofits got together to do that. And one of the things we learned, one, we could open any door. Any door. We had access to all 50, 100 senators, all state representatives because of the nature of the work that we were doing. And that's how the Relief for Charities Act was happening. All the major national nonprofits got together, and it's been quite a year. You know, we were eligible for the payroll protection program, eligible for the ERTC, which is the employee tax credit program. For many nonprofits, they do what's self-insured reimbursement for unemployment compensation. The federal government picked up 75% of that tab. 75%. And just to give you an example, one of our larger YMCA's, New York, $800,000 a quarter for unemployment compensation. So this was really a significant issue for them. Historic investments in childcare came out of the American Rescue effort. So it really was a saving grace for nonprofit organizations. Not that it really closed all the financial holes, but what it did was give organizations time to, what I would say, revitalize and innovate, because they knew during this crisis, this was what they needed to give access to capital, to give them an opportunity to think about what's going to happen post-COVID. And I think that was one of the great outcomes of this, our ability to work collaboratively to help save the industry.
But it was truly a proof of concept of the power of collaboration and maybe a little bit of the, submerging of individual ego and identity for the benefit of the larger whole. Gloria, one follow-up for you too, though. One of the distinctive aspects of We Rise Together is that it really centers community voice, like you said, but here in resource allocation decisions. Talk a little bit about this shift in power and whether or not you think this is something that may be sustained.
Well, I would say that Kevin made a really important point in that philanthropy can't do everything. And so that's the first recognition that we need to make. And so when we think about We Rise Together for an Equitable and Just Recovery, making sure that we are multi-sector is really important. Bringing together philanthropy, business, local government, as well as community voice. What generally happens when we think about big decisions, big infrastructure decisions, big decisions in terms of revitalizing neighborhoods, very often does not include those who it most affects. The power decisions generally lay outside of those who it most affects. So what we've done with We Rise Together for an equitable and just recovery is created a true multi-sector approach with community voice at the center. So as we look at major investments, and so we're looking at 3 areas of investment. We're looking at our kind of cornerstone neighborhood investments, which we would expect to see in the built environment. We would expect to see business practices, which are a kind of investment because business can bring capital to the table and they can bring job creation and procurement opportunities. And then we're looking at the city resources as well, public policy. The way that you bring that together is to make sure that that multi-sector approach comes together in unison rather than in siloed approaches. And that we're doing through working groups where we can actually have members of community participate in the decisions as to where the resources will be invested and how they will be deployed. We are in very early stages of this, but it's important that we begin with this approach. Very often we've seen approaches where decisions are made and then the community voice is brought in later to let us know how you feel about the decisions that we've already made. Well, once you've done that, you've taken agency out of the community. What we want to do is put agency back into community so that they are part of the early decision-making process. Then, as we move forward in making the investments and working with business and working with the city, we are really informed by those who are most affected by the decisions. What we have found in taking this approach is that there is a great deal of funder interest. And the reason there's funder interest is because we know that we need to approach our work differently. At the Chicago Community Trust, part of our mission is to close the racial and ethnic wealth gap. In order to do that, we need to, again, bring together philanthropy, business, and government in a unified manner. We found that funders are really interested in making sure that we have a different and new approach. They see that in Chicago, we've had this long-standing racial wealth gap. And what that has done is that has actually slowed the growth of the city, both in terms of economic growth and population growth. And so in terms of economic health of the region, we know that when we can close that racial and ethnic wealth gap, we're actually going to strengthen the entire city and the entire region. So putting community voice at the center has become a kind of attraction for funders who really want to see change in a significant and sustainable manner. And so it's both the process, but it's also the attraction.
So Brad, that'll probably be a trend that should be worth watching over time on the Candid front. So the next sort of segment of the conversation I call the anti-racist imperative. And so this is the moment in time in our history where many commitments are being made and much narrative has changed about past complicity and future participation in changing the dynamics of inequities. But let's talk about it, how that sort of anti-racist imperative is playing out in organizations. Kevin, you are a national network of really diverse local organizations, but how has the Y overall responded to this moment in time?
Well, thank you, Julie. The Y has been working intentionally around diversity, around race and equity for well over 20 years. But like most of us, the George Floyd murder really was a tipping point for how we need to intensify that work. And we're having a reckoning in our organization. So what I say is we're an American institution. We're dating back to 1851. And we are a reflection of our country in good ways and in bad ways. Racism has been a part of our past, and unfortunately, it's a part of our present. So we have to deal with that internally. We know that as an organization, if we want to be effective at that, we have to start with ourselves. Start with ourselves. And that's where we're on. What I say is we're on a journey to become an anti-racist, multicultural organization. And it is a journey. We meet communities where they are. And clearly, some communities are much further ahead than others, but we meet them where they are. If we want to be effective at this tool, we have to confront ourselves first. And so we've been working on all kinds of fronts: operational, bias training, staffing, leadership pipeline, skill and competency development. In fact, we've been working with an organization out of New Orleans called the People's Institute that really helps us understand and frame what does it take to become an anti-racist, multicultural organization. We don't want people to feel guilty about privilege. We want them to leverage it to move forward in this process. And that's been the conversations we've been having internally. They've been difficult. Some of them have been very difficult. But I firmly believe you can't face change. You can't have change in an organization unless you face the past and understand it, interpret it, and move forward. And so that's what we're doing. It's going to be a slow journey. It's not going to be quick. Just like we didn't get here in 10 days, we got here in 400 years. It's going to take time for us to do that. But it has to be the commitment of the organization and the intensity and the consistency that's going to make the changes we want internally, and then for our community, and hopefully for our society as we move forward. That's our plan.
So in that context, Gloria, what is the role of the board in the journey of an organization, from an organization today to an anti-racist organization?
Well, it is a point of decision. You know, recognizing, as Kevin said, recognizing that we have this history, but we have a choice about the future that we will create. And sitting on the board of the Field Foundation, for example, 4 years ago, we went through a process of educating ourselves, both the self-exploration and jointly as a board, to think about how we could become more focused on racial justice in our philanthropy. When I sat on the board of the Chicago Community Trust, again, we made a decision and we went through a process of really exploring what would it mean for us as a board to work together to close the racial wealth gap. So I think the point of the individual introspection is critical, but also understanding that this is a decision to be made and it goes through a process of change management like every other process of change management. And we have to treat it as an imperative. It is really how we have to think about moving forward and put the proper resources into it. So you can't simply say we're going to change our attitude, but when you go into a process of change, you always have to put resources into it, which means that not only is the board going to go through training, but executive level staff is going to go through training, mid-level staff is going to go through training. We're going to cascade that down to all staff so that people start to come together with a common vision, a common language, a common set of practices. It's not going to change overnight, but certainly we have to bring everyone along. And then we need to think about how do we interact with our stakeholders? How do we bring that racial justice lens in our interactions with our stakeholders? How do we, and on the philanthropic side, how do we have a conversation with our funders, those who have donor advised funds? How do we help them make good decisions that are anti-racist decisions? So you can see that this is not simply something that the board engages in for themselves, but it is really how the board engages in a way that transforms the organization, transforms stakeholders, transform the larger community. And I will say, sometimes it takes particular actions. So for example, very often we don't think about where we put our dollars. How do we invest our dollars? Who do we invest our dollars with? How many minority investment advisors are we utilizing? So we need to put action where it intersects with the economy. Because if we're really going to be an anti-racist organization, we affect the economy as well.
So before I ask Brad to sum it up with some global comments, I just want to remind everyone in the audience there to submit questions. We'll have time for a few of them via the Q&A feature on the right of their browser. So Brad, to sum it up, with special relevance here for board members and leaders and what they need to know to function effectively in this new world that everyone is describing, just in a couple of global comments, how do you see the nonprofit sector as a whole transformed by the extraordinary events of 2020 and the aftermath?
Okay, nothing like an easy question, right? So,
Right.
Again, when we talk about the sector in the aggregate, we have to realize we're talking about an enormously diverse and highly segmented sector. There are over 1.7 million nonprofits in the US, and there's slightly over 100,000 foundations. Everybody knows the Gates Foundation, the MacArthur Foundation, the Ford Foundation, the big names, but the vast majority of foundations are in many cases a husband, a wife, and a checkbook. So, and the same with nonprofits. You have very large nonprofits with budgets of in the billions or well over 100 million. The long tail of nonprofits are very small organizations. So we're dealing with a tremendously heterogeneous sector. But as much as I can hazard a guess, I actually think boards need to be prepared for this year being a much more difficult year than they expected. I think because of the government intervention that Kevin talked about, the foundation response that Gloria talked about, there were a surprising volume of resources available to flexible resources available to nonprofits that they didn't expect to have in 2020. It's not as certain that those will be available in 2021. And some of the underlying problems of nonprofits with, problems with their business models, the facts that, they really didn't have enough revenue to cover their expenses were sort of masked by having this injection of capital. But those problems will come back to roost. At a time, I think, because of the racial reckoning we're talking about, there's a high degree of internal and external pressure on leadership and boards of organizations. So I think one thing boards are going to have to do is really pay attention to the viability of the long-term finances of the organization and not sort of surviving from relief package to relief package. The second thing I think is to find the right balance between the inward focus that's needed to get your house in order when it comes to anti-racism and anti-sexism and the incredible demand that exists in the outside world. We're in a kind of a strange moment. It's very different than 2008. I remember that vividly, 2009, when there was an economic recession. There's actually, the stock market's very strong. Foundations have a lot of resources. And these corporate pledges I mentioned, this $12.6 billion of resources for racial equity since the murder of George Floyd, the bulk of that coming from corporations, in some ways is money chasing use cases. A lot of these corporations are saying, we want to devote $100 million to Black-led or organizations led by people of color. I can't tell you how many phone calls we're getting from mid-level staff in these corporations just saying, hey, how do we know which are the organizations led by people of color? So if you're there's no national registry of organizations led by people of color. So there's a lot of surveying going on. There's a lot of local intelligence and how you aggregate that up when you're a corporation dealing in multiple markets. So there's a lot of information needs. And one thing I would urge boards to do, please, we have something, there are GuideStar transparency seals, gold, platinum, silver, bronze seals, which organizations provide information about themselves, and they get a seal of transparency. There's an organizational demographic component of that, about the demographics of the leadership, the board, the staff, the internal equity practices. That's all been voluntary. We're beginning to make parts of that mandatory. So far, out of 80,000 foundation or nonprofits that have received those seals, only 7,000 have provided demographic information on themselves. So one thing boards need to be able to do is to encourage their organizations to also divulge information about their own internal diversity and demographics. And foundations are sending out unilateral surveys. Foundations are surveying their grantees independently, and that information is not being coalesced into sort of a national data system that would make the transaction cost of moving resources to organizations led by people of color much more frictionless.
So Kevin, how about this question for you? One of the questions from an audience member. Question is, many nonprofits are stretched thin, serving their communities, addressing the financial implications of the pandemic, supporting staff, redefining the workplace, examining their DEI efforts, and more. How can leadership and boards set priorities?
Couple of ways. One is, as you assess your community and finding out specifically what it is that community needs, but more importantly, one of the things, the traps that a lot of nonprofits get caught up in, and I can say a lot of them, and I can improve the why in that scope, is we try to do too many things. Narrowing the focus to figure out what you do well and putting your efforts behind that. And thirdly, I would say, the other area, particularly as they expand themselves and find those resources being thin, what we're approaching now in many of our YMCAs that are varied in size is what we're calling, we're putting together a management service organization, because I think that there is the replication of administrative costs across many of our smaller nonprofits. If we can coalesce that, and which what we're trying to do in the why, is to ensure that we're spending most of our resources on delivering program and services and collating ourselves together to save on some of the administrative overhead, that really kills our ability to be as effective as we want to be on the ground. So I would say that's one of the areas that smaller nonprofits should think about as they move forward, because you really want to spend your time and energy doing the programmatic things that you know is going to make a significant difference in your community,
While still paying attention to what are the practices and the infrastructure you need to be viable.
Correct.
Brad is talking about. Question for you, Gloria. What do you think can be done to sustain unrestricted giving to nonprofits as a long-term way of doing business?
Well, it's part of a mindset, and it is really getting to know, I think Brad mentioned this, of really getting to know the organizations that you serve, that are your stakeholders, and really becoming knowledgeable about them in a way when you have those kind of unrestricted grants, those general operating grants, you know what is being done. So part of the reasons we've had restricted grants is it gave us a way of having confidence that the work that is being done. And so I think it's really becoming much more relationship based and less RFP based. And I think that is part of the process that's happened. When I said that we became more knowledgeable about those hyper-local organizations in the response effort, we really had confidence that they understood their communities and could operationalize. Those relationships were critical. So I really think it is part of the relationships between the philanthropy community and the nonprofit community that's going to create that environment for sustainability.
Maybe only one downside to what you said was, as it becomes more and more relationship based, you risk the exclusive club nature of relationships, and you sort of close some doors to organizations that you might not know. That's something to balance. Kevin, you said something interesting here. You said you stated that you encourage people to leverage their privilege to create change. How do you make that happen while still supporting equity?
Well, because I do think that as people think about their privilege, oftentimes it's from a guilt perspective. And we want to take the guilt away because we want them to use that to leverage opportunities moving forward. So that's part of the conversation you have with folks. Because in many of the groups that they're feeling guilty, well, fine, you maybe the privilege was given to you. So how can you use it to further advance causes of equity and work in that particular perspective? And I think that's the way we approach that. And then too often, some of the conversations we have creates anger and jealousy, and we got to get rid of that if we want to continue to move forward in this equitable work that we want to do.
So Brad, here's an interesting question from a participant. They say, the 2020 pandemic has left the resource divide wider than ever, with the wealthy enjoying unprecedented wealth. How much of this increase in recent funding stems from that spike? And can we expect the same level of support to continue? How can we encourage sustained higher level giving?
Yeah, I think, another way to look at what's going on now is this is a crisis which has brought home to roost a series of long-term trends. I mean, the pandemic itself is related to climate issues, among public health, a lot of other issues. The growing concentration of income in the US economy and the global economy is something that's been going on for decades in both Democratic and Republican administrations. Racial reckoning, racism in this country was not invented when George Floyd was murdered. It goes way back in this country and around the world. So these are long-term trends we're seeing. So there's a long-term trend on concentration of income. We are seeing a larger proportion of that going to philanthropy. I think largely because of the efforts of things like Bill and Melinda Gates and the Giving Pledge, where they have actually created a movement. I mean, it's kind of strange to think. I was talking to the staff of the Giving Pledge once, and I said, what you guys are doing is you're creating a billionaire social movement. A social movement made up of billionaires that have each other as resources that meet, that have placed a positive value on spending a significant amount of their wealth on philanthropy. And then you're seeing people like, Jeff Bezos is now getting on board, Mackenzie Scott. And this is a global trend we're seeing. So I think we'll continue to see this. This is it's part of the volume of the resources. I worked for a billionaire and with a Swiss foundation for a number of years. And it is inconceivable to all of us to realize what that kind of wealth is. You can give $50 million for all of your kids to set them up for life. You can buy, a condo in Ibiza, a chalet in Gstaad, and a home in Oahu, and you still have so much more money left over, you can't figure out what to do with it in your life. And increasingly, we're seeing that the answer to this is philanthropy. Now, there's lots of problems with this. There's problems about taxation. There's a legitimate discussion about how much of that should go to government for higher taxes and how much should be left to accumulate for private ends. And of course, there's no central planning agency or ministry for philanthropy. Philanthropists are very individual in their approaches, and you can't replace, as a lot of us have said, large government systems like education, health, infrastructure with philanthropy. And even with all this money, philanthropy has US philanthropy has a little over $1 trillion in assets and spends around $90 billion a year in grants. Compare that to the size of the stimulus packages that are coming out, and it gives you some idea. So I think what you're going to see is that philanthropy will increasingly be a niched funder, emergency support, long-term innovation, sometimes going against the grain, funding basic science when the government was shutting down funding for basic science, and then risk-taking. That, I think, is the appropriate role for philanthropy going forward, not to replace government.
Think of all the questions we're not able to answer. Like, how should nonprofits be thinking about the source of the money that philanthropy has to dispose? How do we think about nonprofit mergers? How do we think about the different kind of workplaces that are emerging from this period of dislocation? There's so much for board and nonprofit leadership to think about. And I want to thank each of you for your contribution to this kickoff conversation for this conference. And I want to say to those of you who are listening in, if you're joining us for one of our breakout sessions from 12:30 to 1:30, we'll take a quick 5-minute break. And then you can join your next session by navigating to the My Schedule page and selecting Join Session. Last, we'd love to hear your feedback on today's sessions. You can take a survey for each session by navigating to the My Event tab and selecting Take Survey to share your feedback. We appreciate it if you would take a few minutes to do this so we can incorporate your feedback into future sessions. Thank you so much for your interest in helping your organization make this a better world. And we hope to see you at our next onboard sessions on Thursday, April 22nd. Thank you again.